This is the CMS policy series. CMS, for those of you who don't know, is the carbon monitoring systems here at NASA. And this was initiated through the 2010 congressional appropriation. So CMS is geared towards understanding, researching, contributing, quantifying, our understanding of global carbon sources and sinks. And at the moment, we have 30 existing projects within the CMS community. And CMS Applications, hosting this series, is a product of the CMS initiative. And the focus of Applications is to really connect the CMS projects, the CMS PIs, and help them achieve their goals of speaking with and connecting with decision makers and policy institutions. So we strive within the Applications group to really make CMS products a more actionable science. And this policy series is a result of that. We have research speakers to come to Goddard and to present on different types of CMS products, different types of CMS themes. So anything that has to do with ocean, atmospheric, and land carbon will be presented, but from the end user's perspective in terms of policy and decision support. So really quickly, the CMS Applications team is composed of Molly Brown, Sabrina Delgado, Lucia Wu, and me. I'm Vanessa Escobar. So that's the really quick intro on CMS. And to give you a little bit about our speaker, Kate Calvin will be presenting to you on the representation of terrestrial systems in integrated assessment models. And so she is a research economist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is a part of the Joint Global Change Research Institute. Many, many acronyms there. I'm going to let her tell you about her research and get into her talk. But before we get going, one more person and one more group to recognize is the Joint Global Carbon Cycle Center, JGCC. They're a very recent supporter of the CMS Applications Policy Series, and they'll be kind enough to provide extra space and, just additional engagement opportunities for our speakers. So we are all ears, and we're really eager to have feedback from these series. If you have people you feel are relevant to carbon research that we should have on our list, we're scheduled through June, but we're happy to discuss this with you. We can bring them in, and we can also have JGCCC host them. So thank you to JGCCC, and with no more delay, here's Kate.
Thank you, Vanessa, and I thank Sabrina and Vanessa for inviting me today. I'm very excited to talk to you guys here about what I do, which is a little bit different than what goes on at NASA, but I think very relevant and synergistic. So as Vanessa mentioned, I'm going to talk about the representation of the terrestrial system in integrated assessment models. I recognize that a lot of people here may not know what an integrated assessment model is, so I'll start by giving you a brief overview of integrated assessment, or IA. And then I'll talk about one particular model, the Global Change Assessment Model, which is the one I work on at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And I'll give a little bit of the overview into what the model is to sort of give you an idea of the scale we work at and the kinds of questions we can answer. And then I'll give you one detailed analysis using GECOM focused on land and mitigation. And that's a large part of what we've been doing lately. And then the last thing I want to do is a little more open discussion talking about how NASA could help GECOM and vice versa, because I think there's a lot of opportunities for future collaboration. Before I start, as Vanessa mentioned, if people on the online that are calling in have questions, they should use the chat box to ask me. And for people here, feel free to interrupt me as I go. I recognize I'm talking about something you may not be familiar with, and I think this will be a little more interesting for everyone if we have a more dialogue. And I'll manage time to make sure I get through everything. So if you ask me a really detailed question, I might put it off to the end, not because it's not interesting, but just to make sure I get through the material. So, an introduction to integrated assessment models. So an integrated assessment model is trying to couple together representations of human and Earth systems. And so we're linking together things like the economy, the energy system, agriculture and land use with the carbon cycle, or with atmospheric chemistry or other sorts of things that are engaged in the Earth system. And the goal of these models is to provide physical science researchers. There's several goals. They're generally to link together these systems and to focus on interactions between highly complex and nonlinear systems. And a couple of the things that we do, one of the things we do is provide physical science researchers with information about human systems in the future. So we do a lot of scenario work for climate models, and I'll show a couple of examples of that. We also focus on how policies and technologies in one system may interact with other systems. So perhaps you want to look at bioenergy. That's going to affect both the energy system and the agriculture and land use system. So using something like an integrated assessment model will allow you to look at how it interplays with both of those systems at the same time. And these models are used to provide science-based decision support for governments and private sector clients. So we work a lot with both the US government, the European Commission, and other entities to figure out what sorts of questions are relevant for policymakers and how can we help them address them. And we do similar things with the private sector. And so we work with energy companies and other private sector clients for analysis. So some things to note about an integrated assessment model. So we're coupling together human and earth systems, but we're not doing everything as detailed as you might if you looked at a single sector model. These are strategic models, and they're looking at strategic questions and strategic insights. So we weren't designed to model very fine details. We don't do electric grid operations. We're not a dispatch model. We're not going to tell you which generating unit you should use on which day. And similarly, we don't do daily oil market price paths. So we couldn't tell you what the price of gas is going to be tomorrow. That's not something that's in our models. And it's sort of analogous to a climate model versus a weather model. So climate models are getting long-term average weather, not daily weather. And that's the way we sort of think about integrated assessment, is we're looking at longer-term strategic insights rather than daily operation of individual systems. And when I say integrated assessment, the words themselves are fairly generic, and so there may be other ways, other people using integrated assessment to mean something different. In general, what I mean when I say an integrated assessment model is a model that's global in scope, that includes all anthropogenic sources of emissions, and has some representation of a climate system. Beyond that, though, there's a lot of variety in integrated assessment models. There are ones that are designed just to look at optimal behavior. So how much should you mitigate to balance the costs of climate change mitigation with damages from climate change mitigation. There are others, which the kind I work on, that look more at the physical processes and the actual systems themselves and look more at cost effectiveness. So what's the least cost way to get to a particular target, not which target should you go to. And for that reason, these models are going to vary quite a bit in a number of dimensions, and I've listed some of those here. One of them is the spatial resolution. So you're going to have anything from a model that has a single world region to probably the finest resolution integrated assessment model divides the world into something like 30 regions. So they're fairly coarse resolution, but there is a lot of flexibility across that and across models. The second variation across these models is the inclusion of gases and substances. All of them will track carbon. Beyond that, whether or not they include all of the Kyoto gases or some of the short-lived species and ozone precursors will vary from model to model. The energy system details, so how fine you model the energy system, how much, whether or not you get down to the level of buses in your transportation system or you just have aggregate transportation going forward. That varies across models. Similarly, the representation of agriculture and land use. Most integrated assessment models came out of the energy crisis in the 70s and 80s, and so they all have an energy system, but their inclusion of agriculture and land use is a more recent phenomenon. There's a couple of models that have had one for decades, including the one I work on, but how sophisticated it's got has evolved over time, and some of them just don't have it at all. Again, they came out of the energy crises, so they focused on energy first and then realized they could apply this to other things. Economic assumptions and how you model the economy is going to vary across integrated assessment models. The degree of foresight, and so for non-economists, this is how much you know about the future when you're making decisions today. Some integrated assessment models operate in an optimal manner where you know everything that's going to happen in the future when you decide something today, and so you know all the consequences down the line and you can plan around that. Others operate saying you have some expectations about the future, but you don't really know it. Others, you know nothing about the future, and so that's going to vary depending on the integrated assessment model. And the last thing is the sophistication of the climate component. Whether it's a single equation carbon cycle model or a very, very detailed process-based model varies across the integrated assessment models. And this is coming from a lot of different reasons why you will make different choices, but a lot of it has to do with what questions you were asked in what order, what you built out first. So if you started with an energy model and then during the energy crises, did your clients ask you for agriculture and land use sooner or later, and that'll dictate whether that's in and how detailed it is. Yes? Trade.
Your model focuses on the least cost.
Yes.
And often that means trade is the answer,
right?
Right, so trade will vary across integrated assessment models. So you have some models that model bilateral trade and some that global net trade models, and how they do that. So a model that's doing bilateral trade is typically not doing necessarily least cost. They assume that the products you get are differentiated between whether you import them or produce them domestically, and so that'll prevent some trade shifting, and you're largely locked into today's trade patterns. The others that are net trade assume that trade patterns can evolve over time and shift based on relative economics. And that varies across integrated assessment models. The one I'm going to talk about is a net trade model, and it's largely because of its long-term nature. We don't think the trade patterns of today are necessarily going to still be in place in 80 years.
Next week.
Exactly. Okay, so one more slide on integrated assessment models, then I'll do a specific example of one to make this a little bit more concrete. So where do integrated assessment models fit in climate research? And what I've put here is just pictures of the cover of the fourth assessment report, the 3 working groups. And so they're not in the order that you expect them in, since integrated assessment models are typically in working group 3. I put that first because that's, we want to come first. But then there's others, so then working group 1 and working group 2. And so traditionally you think of integrated assessment models being a big contributor to the working group 3 report. We do human systems, drivers of climate change, mitigation of climate change, which is a large part of what's in the working group 3 report. And so you'll find virtually every integrated assessment model out there has somebody from their team that's a lead author or a convening lead author on the working group 3 report. A lot of our papers, that's where we expect to be cited. But we are included in the other 2 chapters as well. And so for working group 1, our inclusion here is through the use of scenarios. And I'll show you some slides on this, but the integrated assessment models provide data to climate modelers to run for the future scenarios that they analyze. And so our work gets included in that report through these scenarios. And then in terms of working group 2, more and more recently, integrated assessment models have started looking at the climate change impacts and adaptation. Since we're coupling together all these systems that are going to be influenced by climate change, we've started to look at how the climate might feed back onto those systems. And so there's an increasing citation of integrated assessment models in the Working Group 2 report. So while our home has traditionally been Working Group 3, we are included in other aspects of climate change research. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is talk about the global change assessment model. So this is one specific integrated assessment model that's run by the Pacific Northwest National Lab where I work. And the hope is, first of all, this will make the idea of an integrated assessment model a little more concrete. And then secondly, the examples I'm going to use are coming out of this model. So it would be good to know a little bit more about what it is. And so we're a global integrated assessment model, and we link 4 major systems together: the economy, energy, land use, and climate. Typically, this model has been used to examine the effect of technology and policy on the economy, energy system, agriculture, and land use, and climate. So like I said, this is one of the models that came out of the energy crisis. So the first version of GECOM, it started in the late 70s, and so the first reports on it were in the early 80s, and so it was very energy focused at that time. At that point in time, it was just energy and CO2 and nothing else, and the rest has been built out over time. We are a technology-rich model, so we look at a lot of different technologies, and that's sort of our focus areas. When we put anything in, we're doing the technological detail. We track emissions of 16 greenhouse gases and short-lived species, including all of the Kyoto gases, but we also do aerosols, reactive gases, and sulfur dioxide in there. And there's a lot of, the driver for that has a lot to do with our interactions with climate models. Those are substances that they're really interested in, and so we want to keep them. We run through 2100 in 5-year time steps, so it's a long-term model. We're looking at the very far future and how that might influence. If you want to get to a particular target in 2100, like 2 degrees, what would you need to do today? Those are the kinds of questions we try to ask. We do have documentation, extensive documentation on a wiki that's public, and it's also an open source model. And so if you want to use GECOM, you can download it, you can have it, you can play with it as you will. We have an annual meeting every fall where we can teach people how to use it. So if people are interested in digging in, it's there. And we hope that through that community that we'll get improvements to the model coming from other communities. A little note on spatial resolution. This always makes me cringe in a science world. We divide the world for the energy and economy system into 14 aggregate regions. So those are fairly large, and you'll note Africa is a single region. So they're huge and they're very diverse across them. For agriculture and land use, we recognize that that's not really, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. So we've further divided our agriculture and land use model into as many as 18 different agroecological zones within the 14 regions, and we end up with 151 geopolitical regions. So it's still rather coarse, but it's a little bit more refined in agriculture and land use. And I should note, in the next month or so, we'll be moving to a 32-region energy economy and a roughly 300-region agriculture and land use. So increasing spatial resolution is continually a goal. We are limited by computational resources and data availability and staff time, essentially. Okay. So what is it? I'm going to animate through this. So like I said, we linked together 4 different systems: the energy, the economy, agriculture, and land use, and climate. And we have varying degrees of detail in the different systems. So the economy in GECOM is fairly simplistic. We represent GDP and population. The energy system, we have a lot of detail here, and so we use GDP to drive energy demand. So the wealthier you are, the more people you are, the more energy that's demanded. And then we balance that demand with supply through adjusting prices. So we have representations of resource bases within the model, so how much coal is in the ground and how much would it cost you to get it out. We have representations of the transformation sector, so how do you convert coal to electric power. And then we have representations of end use, so how much, air conditionings and electric vehicles that might demand that electricity. And so we represent supply and demand, and we balance that through prices. So it's what's called a market equilibrium model, which means that supply and demand are balanced by adjusting prices. So you keep changing the price until all of the markets are cleared. For agriculture and land use, we do something very similar in that it's also market equilibrium, and we're balancing demands for agricultural products with supply through prices. And again, the GDP and population are going to drive the amount of food you need to produce for the world, the amount of wood products and livestock that needs to be produced. However, on the supply side, we're now going to be, the amount of agricultural supply is going to depend on land cover. So we have a representation of land and how productive it is that's input into the model, and then the model in the future will determine how much land is allocated to various uses through economics. And that in combination will give you agricultural supply. So if you know how much land area is planted for corn and you know the productivity of the land when it comes to growing corn, then you know how much corn you've supplied in the world. And land use and land cover is going to evolve over the future as economics evolve. So we're an economic model, and so we assume that landowners look at everything they could do with their land, and they pick the thing that's going to make them the most amount of money. And there are constraints in that you won't be able to produce sugar very well in far north Canada, and so you're not going to make a lot of money doing that, and that's how the physical world constrains this, by you feed it a low productivity for things that you can't do well, and then we allow people to choose among those.
That you can't, or that you're not supposed to be?
Yes, and so we've played with that a little bit, and so we have versions where we've taken out areas that you can't clear now, and we have versions where we leave it in. It tends to be if you look at the definitions of protected land and how protected they actually are, the amounts that you really can't touch are rather small, so it doesn't have a big effect on dynamics in the future, but we can include those.
That's sad.
It is sad. I think it's roughly, it's depending on your classification and how much you view as protected. Agriculture and energy are linked through 2 different things. One is fertilizer and the other is bioenergy. So we produce synthetic nitrogen in the energy system and consume it in the agriculture and land use system to fertilize our crops. And for bioenergy, we produce that in the agriculture and land use and consume it in energy to produce a wide variety of fuels. So those systems are linked. We track emissions of 16 greenhouse gases and species from all anthropogenic activities. We don't do natural emissions, we just do anthropogenic, but we do it from all of the activities that we have. We spend a lot of time on policy and technology, and so for policy, we have different policy types we can put into the model. So things like emissions constraints. So you could put in like the European trade systems emissions caps. You can put into the model, and it will change behavior until that cap is met. We can put in things like carbon prices and influence behavior that way. We can do renewable portfolio standards and force in a certain amount of renewable electricity generation in particular regions. And so we have a lot of different policy levers in the model that affect energy, agriculture, emissions in the whole system. The last thing we have is we have a climate system, so we take all of the emissions we produce and feed them into a climate model. In the normal version of GECOM, the one you would download from our web, the climate model is a fairly simple component. It's the magic model that was produced by NCAR and is maintained now elsewhere, but so it's a very simple and it runs very quickly, and it produces global trends, not spatial data. We have versions of GECOM, however, that are embedded in the community Earth system model, so we can couple to more detailed climate models. It increases your runtime and some other things. Okay. So just to give you a little idea of what goes in and out of the model. So there are a lot of things that are exogenous to GECOM. So they're external forcers that we put into the model. They're not predicted. So population is not predicted in the model. We give it that information. Labor productivity, yes.
A quick question, I'm sorry, from online, Nancy French. How do fisheries and agriculture and other ocean services fit into this?
So we track demand for aquaculture. So we know people eat fish, but we don't have a fishery supply model right now. So we assume that per capita seafood demand is constant going forward. It's something that we think is actually going to be interesting to pursue in the future, particularly with things like ocean acidification that might affect fishery supply. But fishery supply is a very challenging problem, so we haven't done that yet. Okay, technology, policy, they're not predicted by the model, they are fed in. Similar to the physical world, and this is where I think NASA data products could be helpful, we provide the model with estimates of carbon density, potential carbon density, productivity of land, growth functions, so how quickly your forests would grow and accumulate carbon. Those are all exogenous to the model. We feed them in. And then what we track within the model is how, as land changes over time, how that carbon actually accumulates. That's something the model does, but the parameters for that and the functions that dictate that are all exogenous. So the outputs you get are things like emissions, prices, economic activity, energy supply and demand, agricultural supply and demand, and then from our climate model we get temperature and radiative forcing. So a lot of what we'll be asked to do is, can you limit global mean temperature rise to 2 degrees C? And so we can do those sorts of things in the model. And in between you have a model that's shown here as a black box, but there are a lot of, it's not totally black. We do have documentation. Okay. Just one other part I want to talk about with GECOM is terrestrial carbon emissions in GECOM. I figured this would probably be the most interesting part of the model to this, and so I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight into what we do. So we use an accounting method to track CO2 fluxes from the terrestrial system, so it's similar to some of the Houghton et al. Papers. And then these fluxes are passed into a climate model, usually MAGIC, to compute atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and changes in ocean CO2 and other things. And so what we input into the model are carbon densities, both above and below. And so we need to know the amount of carbon per unit of land that would accumulate in an ecosystem if it was allowed to grow undisturbed. So that's what we're looking at, because we want to look at the eventual carbon you would get if you left things alone, and then we have a shape function that tells you how you get there over time. And that shape function is dictated by what we call the mature age. I think mature is probably not quite the right word, because it's really the length of time it takes to get to 80% of its eventual carbon. So if you left it undisturbed, how long would it take to get most of its carbon accumulated, and how much carbon would it get? Those are all inputs into the model. And we do something similar on soils. So we need to know how long it would take the soils to equilibrate after a disturbance. And so the resolution of these parameters, it's for each of the land types in GECOM. So we have different parameters for the different crops. We have forest, grassland, shrubland. But we read it in as an average for each of the 151 agriculture and land use regions. So it's a fairly coarse resolution. So we need averages across larger areas. And the data we currently use is just from some reports that have, they're not spatial data that we're starting from. We're starting from some reports, I think largely from Houghton, that aggregate regions and land types, and we use those sorts of data. Okay, so what do you do with a model like this? The first thing is we've been doing stuff with carbon cycle for a long time. So there was a coupling between it was called the Edmonds-Reilly model, is now called GECOM, back in 1984 with the Oak Ridge National Labs carbon cycle model. And then subsequently we've done a lot of these sorts of couplings between the integrated assessment model and the climate model, largely through the IPCC effort. So we were involved in all of the different scenario processes there. So the special report on emissions scenarios, which people were probably familiar with from AR4 and AR3, and then most recently we've been working on the representative concentration pathways, which will be used pretty heavily in AR5, which is just some reports of that's come out already. So this is showing you the representative concentration pathways, and so these emissions scenarios were were computed by the different integrated assessment models with the goal of getting to different climate targets. And so what we did was we passed from the integrated assessment model to the climate model a suite of different emissions, so different greenhouse gases, chemically reactive gases, and we did all of this at a grid level. So we actually did downscale all of our output to a grid so that they could use in the climate models. Similarly, we passed along land use and land cover. And that information was fed into a suite of climate models, and then they produced these, this is just a figure of global mean temperature. There's a whole bunch of other variables coming out of that. But the future scenarios that are used in the 5th assessment report are coming from the integrated assessment models. And GECOM was responsible for the RCP 4.5, which is the second lowest target. And so that's the one that we were responsible for at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Other things we do is working more with energy interested parties. And so this is from a report in 2007 that looked at the transition of the energy system globally as you mitigate more climate. And so this is just to give you a flavor of other things we do that are not necessarily terrestrial carbon related. So this is global primary energy consumption in 3 different models. The MERGE model from the Electric Power Research Institute, IGSM from MIT, and it's called MiniCam because it was then, but we renamed it to GECOM when we realized it wasn't so mini, and that's from Pacific Northwest National Lab. And so what we look at here, this is primary energy from now until 2100, and the colors are the different fuels that are being used, and you'll notice that this is in a reference scenario, so there's no climate policy. So the bulk of energy use is in coal, gas, and oil, so we're still using fossil fuels. If you have no climate policy, there's a lot of fossil fuels that are still in the ground, we'll keep using those. However, as you start to mitigate, you shift away from these fossil fuels towards low carbon resources. And this is a classic sort of question an integrated assessment modeler is asked. If you're trying to get to a particular climate target, what does it mean for your energy system? Other things we look at is the timing of emissions mitigation. So these curves are called the WRE curves, which I don't know if people here are familiar with. They're from a paper that came out in Nature in 1996. And the WRE is actually the initials of the guys that wrote the paper. So it's Wigley, Richards, and Edmonds. And what they were using is an integrated assessment model to figure out if you wanted to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of CO2, what is the optimal time path of emissions? So if you know you need to get your emissions to decline if you want concentrations to stabilize, but how quickly you do that, they used economics to figure that out. So you don't want to go instantaneously because that's really expensive to do, to totally shut down all of your fossil fuel consumption immediately. So instead you have this slow path where you actually increase emissions for a while and then decline later as you transition your energy system and other uses to lower carbon sources. So this is another use of integrated assessment models. More recently, we've been looking more at the terrestrial system. And so this is from a paper that came out in Science about 5 years ago that looked at land policy and limiting climate carbon dioxide concentrations. And the example I'm going to give later is a follow-on to this paper, but I just give some highlights from it. And what we were looking at was if you were, so this isn't a reference scenario, this is global land cover. So without any climate policy, what you'd expect is you increase cropland as your population expands, you decrease cropland as agricultural productivity improves in the future. But largely, there's not a lot of changes in the energy system or in the terrestrial system. So you have a slight deforestation to make room for these additional crops, but not much happens. However, once you start to mitigate climate change, you have some choices on how you do it. And so the one case we looked at was, what if you incentivize afforestation? So forests store a lot of carbon. What if you paid people to store carbon? And so what you get in that world is a large increase in forests, and you don't use that much bioenergy because you're using that land for forest cover. The alternative is you could incentivize bioenergy but not forests. And then what you get is you clear a lot of forest land to plant more and more bioenergy, and what you're ending up doing, you're basically on a treadmill. Every tree you cut down, you have to make up that carbon in your energy system, so you need more bioenergy, and they're using bioenergy in combination with CO2 capture and storage so that you're actually sucking carbon out of the atmosphere while you're doing it. And so that's what happened, and it was just one of these, you have some trade-offs in your terrestrial system, and that's what we looked at there, and we've done some follow-on work because these are pretty extreme scenarios if you haven't noticed, and so we've done some follow-on that makes them a little less extreme and explores the policy space in between. And then the last example, of general examples I want to show you is on forest disturbance, and this is some work that has come out in the last year that's looking at disturbance rates and what it means for mitigation. And so what the study does, this is the way we kind of address uncertainty within an integrated assessment model. We do sensitivity analysis. So we'll vary one parameter across a large space and see how it actually influences things. And here the parameter that was varied was the disturbance rate. So 100% disturbance rate is sort of our default assumption. And then they varied it, so what if you had half as much disturbance? What if you had twice as much disturbance? And the disturbance here is how much carbon emissions are going out of the land surface. And what you find all of these cases, we got to the same climate target. So we're going to vary the disturbance rate, but we're going to force you to get to the same radiative forcing level in the end. So what happens is, the more disturbance you have, your terrestrial system switches from a sink of carbon to a source of carbon. And as a result, you have to cut your fossil fuel and industrial emissions to compensate for that. And so what happens is, the more disturbance that you have, the less you can rely on your energy, your terrestrial system to store carbon, the more burden you put on the energy system. So those were the general analysis, just to give you an idea of what an integrated assessment model is. Now I'm going to go into one specific example of a paper that is in press now. And so I'll show you, and it's a follow-on to the study I showed with the really dramatic land cover change. And so here we're looking at the role of land in mitigation policy. And as I mentioned, mitigation efforts have the potential to affect land surface through bioenergy or afforestation. And so either of those can reduce emissions. So you can plant trees and store carbon, or you can use bioenergy to cut your use of coal, gas, and oil in the energy system. So it's a supplementary, it's just a supplement or replace. And so both of these options are going to compete for land with food and other uses. So you're putting pressures on the system when you introduce terrestrial mitigation policy. So there's other things out there that we want to use the land for. And so one of the interesting things you can do with an integrated assessment model is look at how these different things play out in the future and what the trade-offs are across various sectors of the economy. And that's what we did here. And the thing to note is the extent to which these mitigation options are deployed depends on the amount of mitigation required and the policy context. So it sort of depends how you set up your policy. What's allowed? Can forests count towards meeting your target, or can they not? Is bioenergy allowed on a large scale or not? And so varying this policy context will end up affecting the deployment of bioenergy, the extent of afforestation, terrestrial carbon fluxes, the area available for food production, the price of food. It also plays out in the energy system, so you would have differences in prices of energy depending on what you do. And so that's sort of what we wanted to explore. So we're going to take one variable, the policy on the land surface, and see how that plays out across all the different systems that are tracked within GECOM. And so the scenarios we're going to do, so we're just going to change land policy, and we're doing a variety of different policies. So the first one is no land policy. So here when you mitigate, the land is interactive, so it'll respond to anything you do in the energy system, but you're not actively trying to do anything there. You're not trying to stop deforestation. If it happens, it doesn't. You're not trying to either incentivize or de-incentivize bioenergy. You're just allowing it to react to what happens in the energy system. The second is an afforestation case. Here we're going to pay people to plant trees. So we're going to tell you, if you want to plant a tree and store some carbon, we'll pay you for the amount of carbon you store because it helps us somewhere else. And so this is a very ambitious policy, but it will induce a lot of afforestation. And those were the two we did in the previous study. And so we've just brought them back again. The next two are sort of red type policies. So we're going to reduce deforestation, but we're going to do it through control measures, through protecting of lands. And so the first one is no land clearing. Here we're saying you cannot expand agricultural area beyond what you have today. You can shift around within that area, but you can't go beyond it. So you're not going to be able to clear any shrubs or trees or anything in order to expand your agricultural area. The third one, we do that, but the fourth one, it's a little less stringent. Here we're only going to say you can't cut into trees. So if you want to clear a shrubland to plant some crops, you can do it, but you can't cut down any trees. And then the last one we looked at was more of an energy-related policy. So bioenergy is the big thing that might induce deforestation in the terrestrial system. So what if we tax that in the energy system? So here you'll have no incentives for afforestation, but you will prevent some of the deforestation by making bioenergy a lot more expensive in the energy system. And so what you get is, as you might expect, land policy significantly alters land use and land cover in the future. So this is looking at global forest cover. When you price trees, so when you give people money to plant trees, they plant trees. And so you get a large increase in the amount of forest cover. And I should note that the response in terms of forest cover looks like it happens really quickly. This is the amount of land that's planted in trees, they're not mature forests immediately. So a lot of these are still growing 50 years later, 100 years later. So we've allocated the land for it, we've planted the trees, but we have to wait for the carbon to actually accumulate. On the other extreme, if you do nothing, you're going to clear that land for bioenergy. And so you have a decline in forest cover to make room for bioenergy. And then in between, you really don't change things that much. So if you prevent it in terms of forests, so if you don't allow yourself to cut down any trees, you're really going to have the same amount of trees you have today. If you tax bioenergy, it depends a little bit on your tax rate, but here we get very minimal deforestation because bioenergy becomes really expensive, and so you don't really use it, and so you're not really changing trees. But forests are only one part of the land surface, and so if you look at land cover, the other categories, you'll see that even two scenarios with the same forest cover, so the no land clearing and the no deforestation have the exact same amount of forest at the end, but they do differ in other ecosystems. So when you don't allow any land clearing, you have a smaller amount of land devoted to agricultural, so cropland and bioenergy, and more land devoted to these other natural ecosystems, where if you just prevent deforestation, you're actually going to expand into these other natural ecosystems to use for crops and bioenergy. So this has a big effect on terrestrial carbon stocks. So obviously there's a huge amount of difference in forest area between the high and the low, and so as you might expect, there's a big difference in the amount of terrestrial carbon stocks and terrestrial fluxes of carbon. And so this is by the different ecosystem types. In this particular graph, negative means an accumulation of carbon and positive means a release of carbon. I know that between different communities that sign mechanism switches, and so I actually had a coworker who flipped my chart upside down to look at it. But that's what we're using here. Negative means accumulation of carbon. So as you might expect, the case where we plant trees, the land becomes a net carbon sink. The place where we cut down trees, land is a net carbon source. All of these cases are getting to the same climate target. So that was something we imposed on the system. We want to limit radiative forcing to 3.7 watts per meter squared. So if you have a big difference in terrestrial carbon fluxes, you have to make it up somewhere. And the thing we noticed is there's only a small effect on total CO2 emissions. So this is total cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. There are small effects. So in some of these cases, you have less CO2 emissions and more methane and N2O than others, but it's not really that big of a difference. The big difference actually comes from looking at the balance between energy and land use CO2. So what's happening in the model is the more, just like we saw in the forest disturbance case, the more your land is a source of carbon versus a sink, the less emissions you can allow in your energy system. So we're basically using energy system CO2 to balance anything that happens in the terrestrial system. And in terms of if you're limiting to a particular climate target, that's what has to happen. Something else has to give if you want to get to the same end climate goal, and you're varying what's happening in your terrestrial world. So what you see here, the place where the land was a net sink, we're allowed to have a lot more emissions in the energy system. And so that'll have implications for prices of energy and costs of mitigation because there's a lot more emissions that are allowable in the energy system. On the other extreme, in the places where land is a source of carbon, we have to reduce emissions a whole lot more in the energy system. And so you're going to see some feedbacks there. And so that's the other part of what we do is look not just at how this is playing out on the land surface, but what does this mean for other parts of the economy, energy, agriculture, and other variables. And so the thing you'll notice is that afforestation is going to lessen the mitigation pressure on the energy system, so you have lower energy prices, but this afforestation is going to compete with land, or compete with food for land. So it's crowding out some of your agricultural production, and so you get really high food prices. And so if you look, this is an indicator of food prices, looking at the price of wheat globally. And you'll see these two have really high prices. So prices of wheat are quadrupling over the century. And in the purple case, it's because we've said you can't expand agricultural area beyond today. So we have a growing population, but you can't expand agricultural area. And so what ends up happening is you end up just increasing the price of it. In the second one, we're having forests compete with food for land area. And so this has a big implication for your food prices.
Land for food is feeding animals plants instead of feeding people plants.
Yeah, and so
there's a big,
yes,
huge scenario difference if
right.
production goes to feed people.
Yeah, and we have in the past done things where we've shifted people's diets, and so if you have a more vegetarian diet, it's a lot less pressure on the land surface and you'll have lower food prices. Here, what we did, we do have a price-induced response on meat consumption. So if I showed you the amount of beef consumption in the world, it'll be lower in these two cases than it was in the others. But it's not because we've actively shifted their diet like as an external forcer. It's because it just got too expensive, and so people stopped buying steak. And so you would see that sort of feedback there. But it's a very important point that diet really influences the amount of land area you need and prices and things like that. Okay. The second finding is that no land policy, that's the one, it had low food prices because we allowed expansion of cropland, we allowed you to do whatever you want at the land surface, you got really low food prices, but the energy system had to compensate for these deforestation emissions. So we got really high mitigation costs and really high energy prices. So the price of all of your fuels and electricity is really expensive in that case. Food is cheap, energy is expensive. And this is just showing you, this is the mitigation costs across the 5 scenarios. And so the no land policy and the biotax cases, these are 2 where the terrestrial system was a net source of carbon, they have the highest mitigation costs. And so what we concluded from that, it depends on what you're looking at, which one. You couldn't say that one policy was better than or worse than the other because they all had different trade-offs. They had a different implication for energy than they did for agriculture. And the thing that we didn't do in this particular paper was look at things like albedo and temperature rise. So if you're really dramatically changing your land surface, you're affecting climate, not just through changes in emissions, but also through changes in reflectivity of the Earth's surface. And so we've done a different study using similar cases where we fed this land cover into the community Earth system model and looked at the difference in temperature rise as a result of just land surface. So we gave it the same atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and everything else and just swapped out one land surface that had a lot of trees and one that had a lot of bioenergy or grasses. And what you get is a difference in global mean temperature rise at the end of the century of about 0.5 degree Celsius, and the one where you deforest is a lot cooler world than the one where you afforest. But it should be noted, if you look at it spatially, the regional temperatures are a lot different. So this is looking at the blue areas are cooler in the clearing land case than the afforestation case. And so you see a lot of cooling in the high latitudes and a slight warming in the other in the low latitudes. I should note, if you were to look at this as a difference from 2005, the land clearing case actually has colder temperatures in Siberia than we do today. So I'm not sure that the cooling is necessarily something you're looking for. So it's on global average, it's cooler than planting a lot of trees, but I don't know if it's colder in the places you want. So I don't know that I don't think you should conclude that that's a better world. Yes.
Really quick, are the GECOM qualified scenarios for land use, land cover for the RCP 45, are they available, the actual gridded data and the regional totals? Is that available to distribute?
They are, and there's a couple of public websites where they're available, so I think it's probably available for the PCMDI website and also through a YASA website. If that person wants to send me an email, I can find links to it. But they all were because they were made available for all the climate modeling teams to download and run on their own. And anything you can't find, we can provide for you. Yes?
So I assume that your model doesn't have the feedback where if energy prices are super high, your GDP will be a lot lower because people aren't able to drive really far to go to jobs and blah, blah, blah. And then the other one is if food prices are really high and energy prices are really low, you could compensate by growing food in greenhouses. Or
yes, we don't,
47-story buildings, bionic things like that. I mean,
right, we don't have the sort of greenhouse. It would be possible to put into the model. We just haven't done it yet. But that would be an interesting thing to go for because that would, and then in terms of energy and GDP,
it's possible
it's
right
totally
now.
possible, So we should just put that in as an option and it would get you lower. For energy and GDP, we've done cases where we allowed high energy prices to reduce GDP, and we've done cases where we haven't. And this current version doesn't because it gets hard to diagnose what's changing with what when everything is changing. And so we've turned it off for this particular study, but we can turn it back on in the future. Okay. So that was the example I have. The last thing I wanted to talk about was NASA and GECOM. And what I'm going to show you is one example where we're using NASA data to in our own work, and then another where we could talk about how we might do better in the future. And so the one, as I mentioned earlier, we model at a fairly coarse resolution. And so we have the agriculture and land use in GECOM is divided into 151 regions around the world. So it's pretty coarse. Within the U.S., it means dividing the U.S. into about 9 different areas. And so they're fairly coarse, and this is blowing up the U.S. to show you. So all of the Southeast is a single region. And so they're very, very coarse. So some of the work we've been doing, this is Tris West's work, who I think a lot of you may know, is downscaling GECOM to grids. And what he's doing is he's using MODIS to do this. And so what he does, the first step is actually GECOM and MODIS don't actually start from the same point. So we didn't calibrate to MODIS to begin with, and so we have different distributions of crop forests and other land. So what he does is he takes MODIS and uses it to come up with the geospatial distribution of the different land types and then puts it on a grid. But he's trying to match GECOM land areas. So he's not matching MODIS perfectly in the base year, but he is matching GECOM perfectly in the base year. But we're using MODIS to calibrate a downscaling algorithm so that we can put the land, the different crops or land types, crops, grass, shrub, and forest onto a grid. And these grids are 0.05 degree resolution. And the reason we did this initially was because we wanted to pass this information into a climate model. So climate models need a gridded land cover. They don't like the 151 region land cover. And so Tris has been working on that. And so for the base year, the geospatial distribution is coming from MODIS. And then in the future, he matches the change in land cover that's predicted by GECOM. And so you can see here it's telling you whether it's expansion or contraction. So this is a pathway that's getting to, it says 2.6. It's 2.6 watts per meter squared, which is roughly consistent with a 2 degrees Celsius world if your climate sensitivity was 3 degrees C. And what you see here in the U.S., we have an expansion of cropland in order to get to 2.6, and that's because the U.S. is a really good agricultural has really good agricultural productivity, and so we're growing a lot of bioenergy here to help us meet our mitigation target. We're also, though, this is a case where we allowed forests to help us meet our climate target, so we're also expanding forests in the U.S. And you'll just see that they're in different areas. So we're going to expand forests on the East Coast, we're going to expand bioenergy and crops in the middle of the country. And so this is some work he's been doing that's using MODIS to constrain and calibrate a downscaling algorithm for GECOM so that we can actually produce maps of where land is. Something I think we could do in the future is actually use MODIS to initialize GECOM so that he has to do a scaling step, but there's no real reason for it. That wasn't the data set we picked the first time we calibrated, and there's no reason we couldn't move to it now. The second thing, this is also from a paper that Tris just published recently that I think people here were actually co-authors on, and it was sort of talking about how you might be able to link carbon monitoring systems with integrated assessment. And the thing that Tris noticed was that the variables and data that you use for a bottom-up inventory-based carbon stock flux estimates are the same data that goes into integrated assessment model. So we have information on utilities, transportation, commercial buildings, residential buildings. We know about people and livestock and industrial sectors. We're calibrating to probably the same data that you're using for these inventories. We use the International Energy Agency statistics and the FAO agricultural statistics, and that's how we initialize our model. And then in the future, we can show you changes in those particular variables. So we have all of these variables both in the base year but also in the future. And so that's something where I think you could probably seamlessly go from a bottom-up inventory accounting system of carbon to the future and how that might be projected to change under different various policy contexts. The other thing that I think is interesting is some of the inputs into an integrated assessment model are things like net primary productivity, soil carbon, carbon density, carbon stocks. And that information, what we use right now are just information from the literature. But if we had more detailed information spatially, we could incorporate it into an integrated assessment model, and then you could go, again, seamlessly from the past and present into the future. Yeah. So that's what I have. People have questions or comments or? It's a quick tour of integrated assessment.
Let me ask one while we're waiting for the online people. So what I always was confused about is, can you say a few more words, because you lost me in the last 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Initialization. So when you say that, you mean, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that
Right.
like the real, so I mean like, for example, weather models. We have today, and then it projects, so it basically says the cloud is over me today, and tomorrow it's going to be over New York.
Right.
Wind is going from this to there, and this is the, so you basically, you know where you're going.
Yeah.
But I think for economic models, it's a lot more confusing because the Congress might become Republican tomorrow and
Yeah.
get rid of the EPA, and therefore all of our things, so stuff happens. So So it's very unclear to me what you mean by this kind
Okay, so
future baseline,
Yeah.
whatever.
So we initialize, I think I go back. a long way.
Initializing. I just
So
don't
we
understand.
initialize to what actually happens today, not trend, or not what might happen in the future. So what that means is that we start from, in 2005, we make sure that the model produces the energy statistics you might see in the in the International Energy Agency produces. We make sure we match FAO, agricultural consumption and production. All of those are calibrated into the model. So we know what the world looks like today. We know how much coal is being consumed. We know how much electricity is being produced. And that's all calibrated in. For the land surface, we calibrate the amount of land that's in forests versus crops versus grass versus shrub. That's calibrated. And then what happens going forward is that'll change based on some other scenario drivers. So in terms of switching Congress, that would just be, we could feed it a policy that said, we don't care about the environment anymore or something. And so that would be an external forcer going forward. But in the base year, we do start from a representation of the world, and we make sure that we match that. And for the land surface, what we match the hurt hide crop and pasture land product exactly, but for the other natural ecosystems, things like forest and grass and shrub, we're using some stage potential vegetation maps rather than MODIS data. And so our forests are higher than what you actually would see from a satellite today. We have more forests than you'd expect. And that's something that should be fairly easy to change. We didn't have an incentive to do it before.
So you should note that the definition of forest is very complex.
Yes.
Because,
Yeah.
we've discovered that 10% of the world's forests are not in a forest. They're just trees lying about.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
here in Greenbelt, we don't live in a forest, but there's tons of trees in Greenbelt.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really a significant difference of what your definition.
Right. Yeah. Definition matters, and then data product matters. But for consistent, I think there's value in being consistent with what other people do, even if it's a definition.
Yep.
Yeah. That's a little different.
I have a 1 o'clock that I have to run to.
Okay.
I was wondering if you are around after 2 o'clock today.
I don't know.
Well, I'll get to that
I'll be back in my office after she has one.
Okay. If not, write down my email, and you can definitely.
But I do.
Okay.
We're going to take Kate to lunch across the street. If anybody does want to continue discussion, we can go there. Mobile, email,
Yes.
and if you'd like to spend the day at Goddard, you're welcome to do that as well, so it's completely up to you. But if there are no more questions, okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
It was really exciting, Kate. Thank you. And it was a perfect segue to our next policy talk. If you see up on the screen, I don't think the people online can see this, but next month our policy series speaker is Jeff Waters, and he's from the Ocean Conservancy, and he will be presenting on ocean acidification policy. So thank you very much for the segue. And again, please send us your feedback. You can send it to me, to Molly, Sabrina, or Lucia. We're eager to hear from you, and thank you again for coming. Updates are on the CMS website, carbon.nasa.gov, and we will see you all in a month. Thanks.